All right, so now we want to talk about goodwill impairment. And so FASB requires you to, if you carry goodwill, you have to test for impairment of that goodwill every year to determine whether or not goodwill has indeed been impaired. Recall that goodwill just sits there in your books at whatever amount was the excess over the purchase value. If you recall, we had an amount of the purchase, and then we allocated that amount to the various of assets and liabilities, and anything left over is goodwill, and that goodwill just sits on your books. FASB figures there's no rational and systematic way of amortizing that like other types of assets, intangible assets. And so what they require in the alternative is to do this impairment test every year. Now, this involves valuing assets of assets including the goodwill involved of an operating unit. Well, and the book goes through quite extensively what is an operating unit. It's really rationally, it is what you think it is. It's a subsidiary, it's a unit, it's a division of a company. So these assets acquired and liabilities assumed along with goodwill are assigned to reporting units. And this goodwill test must be done at each reporting unit level for impairment. Now, again, you understand, I think, at this point, how to assign that goodwill. You understand that the value remains unchanged, at least until all or part of that subsidiary or operating unit is sold, or until it's determined that there's a permanent decline in value. In that case, what we do is we do a subjective test rather than, and they call it a qualitative assessment. In other words, we're looking for qualities out there that would cause our goodwill as well as the overall value of that operating unit to go down. And so this goodwill test, if it was simply a quantitative test, that would require every year for a company to bring in people, a company that would have to determine whether or not this impairment incurred. That would cost companies a lot of money. And so FASB, realizing this, decided that what they would do is allow companies to start out by doing a qualitative test, performing a qualitative test to see if goodwill had been impaired. Now, those qualities that they talk about are things like, well, pretty common sense things, really. So you have to look at qualitative factors first to determine whether or not goodwill has been impaired. And if it's more likely than not that goodwill has been impaired, then you have to go through this quantitative testing, and that's where appraisers might have to come in. As a matter of fact, probably will come in and at that point give you valuations. And so qualitative factors to consider is such things as decline in economic situations in general, might look at deterioration in that company's, that unit's particular area of business, cost factors such as raw materials, labor, things like that, overall financial performance of the reporting unit, and then any other relevant entity-specific events that are large changes, bankruptcies, things like that. And so if after you do your qualitative test for impairment of goodwill, and if you have determined that the unit's fair value is greater than its carrying amount, then you do nothing. Okay? And so if the answer is yes, stop. If the answer is no, you have to go to these quantitative testing measures, and that's where you would probably have to get the experts, the valuing experts in, and that's where the money issue comes into play, because it's going to cost quite a bit of money to value this reporting unit. Okay, so step 2 is where we test for impairment, our quantitative test. And so what you're going to do in step 2 is determine whether or not the carrying value of goodwill, the implied value of goodwill is less than the carrying value, what's on your books as goodwill. And so how do you do this? Well, it's just like the company did at the very beginning when it was trying to figure out whether or not there was any goodwill in the first place. They had to allocate the purchase price to the various fair values of assets and liabilities it was acquiring. And then any excess purchase amount, any excess consideration not allocated to those assets and liabilities was considered goodwill, and that was the carrying value, the original carrying value, right? Well, they have to go through this process again and allocate fair value to all the assets and liabilities of this reporting unit, and any excess, if any, goes to implied goodwill. And then what you have to do is you have to compare the implied goodwill with the carrying value, and if implied goodwill is less than the carrying goodwill, the recorded goodwill, then you have to take a loss for the difference. And so they have an example in here. Of course, if implied goodwill is not less than recorded goodwill, you don't have to do anything. But if it is, then an impairment loss is recorded for the excess. And so here we have an example that's in the book. You've got 3 reporting units. Apparently, after doing their qualitative assessments, the only reporting unit that may, and again, this qualitative test basically requires management to ask, is it more likely than not that goodwill is impaired? And so there has to be greater than 50% chance that goodwill is impaired. If there's less than a 50% chance, and again, it's a subjective test, but I'm just saying this is the standard that FASB requires. If it's not more likely than not that goodwill is impaired, you do nothing. But if there's a greater than 50% chance that goodwill is impaired, then you have to go to the quantitative test. So anyway, let's say in this case they think there's, after doing the qualitative test of goodwill impairment, they determine that DSM Wireless is more likely than not to have their goodwill impaired. Then they've got to go to the quantitative. So here, the acquisition fair value as of January 1, 2015, $748 million for DSM Wireless, and they have recorded $155 million of goodwill. And so, since they've determined that it's more likely than not that goodwill has been impaired, they go and get the fair value of this reporting unit as of the impairment date, the impairment test date. Here it's at the end of year 1. And so the fair value overall of DSM Wireless is $600 million, and then they have to allocate that amount to the various fair values of the assets and liabilities of this reporting unit. What they come up with is the value assigned to identifiable net assets, and then what they come up with is a fair value that is in excess of the value assigned to the identifiable net assets of $596 million. So there's an excess of $4 million. That's your implied goodwill. The excess after assigning values to the identifiable net assets. And then you compare the implied goodwill, the value assigned to goodwill, in this case of $4 million, to the carrying value of goodwill. And if it's less, you have to take an impairment loss for the difference. Now, obviously, you might have a situation where the fair value is going to eat up all the goodwill, right? I mean, if this had been fair value of $550 million, they'd still have to allocate the fair values to the net assets, right? The identifiable net assets. And that number would be $550 million. Obviously, the value assigned to goodwill would be a negative number. But you can't take a loss greater than your carrying value. So in that case, you'd be limited to your carrying value. So in that case, there would be zero value assigned to implied goodwill. Your carrying value would still be $150 million, and so your $155 million, and so your impairment loss would be limited to $155 million. Now note here some other requirements that deal with disclosures. You must report the facts and circumstances that lead to the impairment. It's probably all that stuff that you considered in your qualitative assessment. The method that you use to determine the fair value of the associated reporting unit. And then you also have to report the values for all of this reporting unit's remaining assets and liabilities at no change. And so they stay on the books at the original fair value assessment, even though through your goodwill impairment test, those fair values may actually go down. So I think that's their point there. And again, it's a matter of, that's what it cost you. Even though the values have now gone down in those assets, you can't report a loss on the value of the assets. Now you can do that if you sell the assets, but as long as you're carrying those assets in that reporting unit, then you've got to keep them at the reported values of the original reported values, I guess I should say. Note that GAAP and IFRS are pretty close, except they have a one-step process. A little bit different, but not much different. Now notice here that under IFRS, they allow you to reduce assets pro rata if those values have decreased, whereas the only thing we're doing with our assessment is determining the value of the goodwill now as compared with its carrying value. And so there's never any reduction in the value of the reporting unit's underlying net assets, just the goodwill. Not true under IFRS. Now, you might have other intangibles, and I think there was an example earlier where, this Sun company had I believe trademarks was one of the assets that they had. Let me look back here. Yeah, trademarks. If you look on page 88, they have, Sun Company had trademarks as one of their assets that was being sold to Parrot Company. And in that example, the trademarks had an indefinite life. Well, it's an intangible asset. It's got an indefinite life, so we can't amortize it like we can. For example, in that same example, they had patented technology which had a finite life of 10 years. In that case of the patents, that was amortized over a 10-year period, but the trademarks just sat there at their original fair value. And so because the trademarks had an infinite life, they still have to be tested for impairment. And so all identifiable intangible assets with finite lives should be amortized over their useful life. And again, there's some factors that should be considered in determining the useful life of an intangible asset. And so intangible assets with indefinite lives and that just simply means that it extends beyond the foreseeable future, are tested for impairment on an annual basis, just like goodwill. Now, the entity has a choice here. They can perform a qualitative assessment to determine whether it's more likely than not the asset is impaired. Certainly that would be the least costly way of doing it. Now, again, after doing this qualitative test, if it is more likely than not that the asset is impaired, meaning it's gone down in value, then you have to do a quantitative test, just kind of like you had to do with goodwill. Except it's much easier here because you don't have to allocate to these other assets. You only have one asset, the intangible asset, and you simply compare the carrying value with its current fair value. And then if the fair value is less than the carrying value, you're going to recognize an impairment loss because at that point it's considered impaired. And then from then on, the carrying value will be the new reduced fair value of that intangible asset. All right, so that's basically all that I want to discuss in this chapter. And so that's the end of our lecture for chapter 3.